Before we get started, I just want to say I'm really excited to be doing an online civic engagement training. Just a little background, before and during the first half of the session, gave 6 of these presentations. We presented in Billings, I was in Great Falls, Missoula, Hamilton, Bozeman, and Sanders and Minerals. And during that time, we engaged 79 people, but we also missed a lot of folks around the state. And so we decided we needed to experiment with a webinar. And I also think the timing is great for this because the second half of the session has just started. And so it's really crunch time at the Capitol right now and a really exciting time to pay attention and to be involved. So without further ado, this is Becoming a Citizen Advocate, How to Protect and Expand Our Public Places during the 2019 legislative session. So the question we've been asking to kick these trainings off has been, what is civic engagement? What does that mean to you? And around the state, we've come up with a pretty comprehensive list of different forms of civic engagement. For example, voting, engaging your representatives, showing up to public events, joining groups, organizing others, running for office, and there are truly many more. But a definition I like is that civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. Really simply put, it's promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. And before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I just want to point out that if I say something that's not totally clear, or if you miss something, on your screen there should be a little chat box, and if you click that icon, there's an opportunity to take part in a public chat. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in that message box. I will try to get to them if they're relevant to the slide. I might turn it over to Noah Marion or Pat Flowers to talk about those, to answer your question as well. But please use that to your advantage. All right, now to do a little background. I like to go over some legislative session basics just so that we're not assuming that way we don't have to assume that everybody's on the same page. So to start, a bill is introduced either in the House or the Senate. And let's just go down the path of the Senate. A bill is introduced into the Senate, and the first reading takes place, and from there it will be referred to a Senate committee. And a committee is a group of legislators appointed by the legislature to consider the details of proposed legislation. There are committees in the House, Senate, as well as joint committees. And once that bill goes to the committee, there's an opportunity for a committee hearing. And a committee hearing is just when the bill is brought to a committee by the author, and then time is included for public comment. And from there, the committee will choose to take action on this bill. And they'll either refer this bill to the back to the floor in the Senate, or they might kill the bill. But if the bill goes forward and is recommended to the floor. It will go back to the main body, the Senate, and the second reading will take place. And during the second reading, there's also time for floor action where the bill can come up for debate. Amendments can be made, including riders can be offered. And the first of 2 votes is taken. And then between the second and the third reading, usually there's a 24-hour, if not longer break, where the bill will move on to the third reading where it's up for the final vote. And after, if this bill is voted on again and passed, it will transmit to the House, where it will go through that same process of being recommended, referred to a committee. The committee may or may not make a recommendation on the bill. It will be voted on during the second reading, where floor action can take place, and then possibly voted on during the third reading. And if a bill makes it all the way through the House and all the way through the Senate, then the bill has to be the same both in the House and in the Senate in order to see the governor's desk. So this is where a conference committee might come into play, and that is a joint committee where the House and the Senate appoint members of their body to resolve disagreements on a bill, so that the House and the Senate then can ensure they're voting on the same bill. So this is roughly 90% of, if not more, of what happens during the legislative session. And we tend to move through this really quickly. So I'm going to take a moment, and if anybody has any questions about this process, please ask them in the chat box above. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. All right. Oh, and let me provide you an example. Is sometimes we'll have a piece of legislation that makes it through one body, and then it's killed in the other body. For example, in 2017, Senate Bill 330, or the Property Assessed Clean Energy Enabling Legislation, the nickname was PACE. Basically, PACE would have financed energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation upgrades to buildings. And it passed the Senate with a 31-19 vote. And then it was transmitted into the House. And Senate Bill 330 was assigned to the House Natural Resources Committee. Some people thought perhaps it should have gone to the House Energy Committee. And the intent was to kill it on arrival. And so that bill did not make it out of committee in the House, and thus didn't make it any further in the legislative process. All right, we can move ahead. So, something that I hope folks noticed is that there are multiple choking points in that process. And simply a choking point is a point in the process where a bill can be killed. That can happen during the committee, the second or the third reading. That can, if it doesn't happen in one of the legislative bodies, say the House, and it's transmitted to the Senate, then it has a whole other opportunity, a whole host of opportunities to be killed in the second reading, third reading, or the committee before those in the Senate as well. Also, I'd like to make an important side note and make sure that we all know what a bill versus a resolution versus a referendum is. So a bill is what we most typically see cross the floor of the legislature, and that's where our representatives are voting on future laws. This has 10 days to be vetoed by the Montana governor, And if not vetoed, it becomes a state law. And then a resolution does not cross the governor's desk like a bill, and it does not directly affect Montana law either, but it does send a message, oftentimes referred to as a wish list, and that message can go to our federal representatives. And an example of this, last year during the 2017 legislative session, we saw Representative Kerry White out of Bozeman. He introduced a resolution to remove wilderness study area designations on 7 Montana wilderness study areas. And that was passed. And even though the original intent of the resolution was changed, Daines and Gianforte used it to show local support for federal bills that attempted to remove protections for Montana wilderness study areas as well. And then finally, referendum is voted on by the legislative body to be put on the ballot for the people to vote on. And this can be a strategic way for one party to push legislation if the governor is of a different party. We saw this happen in the 2017 legislature, and it was on the ballot last year, referendum number 129, or LR 129, and that's the legislative referendum that prevented a person from collecting another person's ballot or another voter's ballot, with certain exceptions. And that was voted on and passed by the Montana people. And I just want to answer a question really quickly. It looks like Dawn asked, can testimony be given remotely? And I'm actually going to turn this over to Pat to answer really quickly. Pat, you're off mute.
Okay, Jacob, as far as I know, I've never seen a committee accept remote testimony, but I don't have the rule book in front of me, so to speak, so I don't know if that's an absolute or whether it's just the norm, but you can certainly send in and submit through somebody else written testimony, but I have never seen so far any type of remote testimony accepted, like via telephone or even a TV.
Okay. Thank you. Noah, do you have anything to add to that? Have you seen or heard of testimony being given remotely?
I think the best option for that is like what Senator Flowers said, is that you can write your testimony up and you can send it to the committee, or if it's a bill that MWA is working on, we'd always be happy to turn that into the committee secretary for you, and that way it's part of the record on the hearing.
Great. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Senator Flowers. And then it looks like Patty asked, how does a bill get blasted out of committee? And that's slightly different in the House than in the Senate, and that's a good point to bring up as well. If a committee decides to table a piece of legislation and not vote it forward, or recommend it to the body, then it's possible for the body to vote and bring that piece of legislation back for second reading. And in the Senate, that's a simple majority, whereas in the House, the number of votes needs to reflect the number of people in the majority party. So I think that's 59 votes in the House right now. All right. So what are some of the best times to speak up? So during the House and the Senate, it's likely that committee is one of the best opportunities to speak up. And that can look like testifying at a hearing or by contacting a legislator on the committee. He may have an opportunity ahead of the second reading when the bill or resolution is up for debate on the floor. You may have an opportunity ahead of the third reading when the bill or resolution is in a final vote. And then also during the conference committee, especially if you have a representative that is on that committee. And then also not to be overlooked is the governor, Steve Bullock. He has an opportunity to pass or veto a bill. And so he's somebody that we can lobby as well. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Noah Marion, who we have all heard from briefly. Noah is Montana Wilderness Association's lobbyist during the 2019 legislative session. So Noah, I will bring those bills up as you start talking about them.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. So the first, and these are kind of current bills that we're watching right now. There have been plenty of other pieces of legislation that have come and gone earlier this session. So if folks have specific questions on bills that aren't listed here, feel free to ask, and I will try and share whatever information I have. So SJ20 is Senate Joint Resolution 20, which is a bill to conduct an interim study of our wilderness study areas in Montana. This bill, while we support the concept of a public process around our WSAs and trying to find a long-term management solution, we do have significant concerns with the justification language for the need for this study. The hearing for this bill, the initial hearing was in the Senate Natural Resources Committee on Monday, which Senator Flowers sits on. Many of our organizational representatives that have worked on the WSA campaign for the last few years attended and testified. And the basic points of our testimony here were we support the idea of a process where diverse stakeholders and the public are allowed to weigh in, and we formulate options for long-term management solutions for our wilderness study areas, but that we do not support the language in the bill as it stands, specifically the whereas clauses. There are a number of falsehoods about wilderness study areas that are concerning for us and seem to indicate a preordained outcome before the study begins. So that it had an initial hearing. We are hopeful that we will see some amendments that will make that something that we can actually support, but at this moment we are opposing that. The next bill that's kind of been our big priority this session has been Senate Bill 24, which was introduced by Senator Terry Gauthier. This bill is kind of an all-around outdoor recreation infrastructure funding bill. So what it does is right now when you register a light motor vehicle, you can opt to pay a $6 fee that goes towards our state parks, our fishing access sites, and towards the Montana Heritage Commission. Specifically, the funding from this goes to Virginia and Nevada cities. What we would like to see is to see that optional fee increased to $9 And from that additional $3, another $1.38 would go towards state parks, who are facing a huge maintenance backlog of $22 million right now, and they really need increased funding. Another $1.37 would go towards a new Made in Montana Trails grant program. For those that don't know, the major source of funding for Montana to do trail maintenance and trail projects across the state comes from federal dollars through the Recreational Trails Program. But this year, the Recreational Trails Program saw $3.5 million worth of grant requests, but they only have $1.5 million allocated for the state of Montana. So that's $2 million worth of great projects that aren't going to be funded because there just isn't money. So we'd like to see the state also put some revenue aside that we can use to do trail projects. And that bill came from the Montana Trails Coalition, which MWA is a member of. And the trails funding would go towards both motorized and non-motorized trails. The next bill that we've been watching, which isn't as high a priority, but was kind of a backup if SB 24 did not get as far as it has, is HB 739. That bill was actually tabled in committee yesterday, so it does not look like it's going to move forward. But what it would have done is, instead of having an optional $6 fee that went to state parks, fishing access sites, and Virginia and Nevada City, it would have made it a mandatory fee for everybody. So across the board, everyone would pay for it. 77% of Montanans already pay for that fee, so it would have created a little bit more revenue for the department, but it has passed, or it has been tabled, and it also did not have any of this trail-specific funding, so that's why SB 24 is a bigger priority for us. The next one on our list here is House Bill 265. That is a bill that would require any conservation easements that FWP would like to do to go through the land board for approval. I'm sure many of you have heard, but I'll give a brief kind of background on this. So there's a big conservation easement that is out in eastern Montana called the Horse Creek Easement. Took them years to put together, hundreds of hours of time of department staff, and big commitment from the family, and this would have provided a large amount of access for hunters in eastern Montana. And that bill was approved by everybody until it got to the land board. The land board decided not to approve it, which kind of just threw years of work into the trash can. And there wasn't really a great justification for why they wanted to disapprove of that easement. So the governor went ahead and approved it by himself, saying he did not need the land board's approval. That decision was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the governor did win that case, and the court decided that he did have the right to approve the easement. HB 265 from Representative Kerry White would require that those easements go through the land board. And Senator Flowers is also on the committee that just heard that today. We thank him for voting no on it, but it did pass out of committee today and is going to the Senate floor for second reading. This is certainly a bill that we believe the governor will veto, but we would have rather not seen this happen at this time. It's kind of an unnecessary piece of legislation that's already been decided by the Supreme Court, and just adds an undue amount of politics to a decision that shouldn't have politics involved. And then I believe the last one on our list here is Habitat Montana, which is a program that's been around for decades that uses sportsman and fishing license dollars to protect habitat and purchase some of those easements that we were just talking about. That is going through the budgeting process. Senator Flowers was in Finance and Claims, so he might have a bit more updated status on that one, but it's my understanding that the program's funding has gotten through the House in a clean way and in a way that we can support. And the last one on our list here is SB 242. This was a bill from Senator Roger Webb that would have eliminated the light motor vehicle registration fee for our state parks, fishing sites in Virginia and Nevada City, and created a state parks decal that you could buy for $35 every year. We opposed that bill. The fiscal note, which Legislative Services prepares, which tells you what the fiscal impact of a piece of legislation would be, showed that this would cost Fish, Wildlife, and Parks $3.7 million every year. It would cripple the department, and when they're already facing a serious maintenance backlog, it's just the wrong way to go. We did have these decals in 2002 and 2003, and only 1% of people registering their vehicles actually purchased one. So it was really unpopular and an idea we've tried, and it has failed. And I'm happy to report that that was tabled unanimously today in the Senate Fish and Game Committee. So it does not look like that threat will continue.
Awesome.
And those are kind of the things that we're watching that are coming up right now. Happy to take questions at some point, but I'll hand it off to Jacob now.
Thank you, Noah. That was a wonderful review of all of those, overview of those. Yeah, I'm going to, while that information is fresh in everybody's mind, if anybody has any quick questions, I'm going to open it up to Noah and Senator Flowers.
Yeah, I'd add that as a follow-up on the question related to what happened to Habitat Montana and financing claims today, we just heard the presentation from all the committees and all the departments, but we didn't take any action. So, and there were very few questions. We actually got through all 5 sections today on an informational basis, and then we're going to meet on Thursday to consider any amendments.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to move forward now. All right. So now starts the advocacy portion of this training. And that starts with the mantra, contact your elected official. Your elected official works for you, which means you need to steer them in the right direction by communicating your priorities. And it helps to tell them that you're a constituent. Our elected officials tend to listen to their constituents a little bit better than non-constituents. So, who represents you at the statewide level? We have a senator and a representative, and we also have the governor, Steve Bullock. And you can look up who your senator or representative are at ledge.montana.gov. And you can also look up all of the bills that we just talked about at that website, and you can look at the exact language on those bills as well as what time the committee will be meeting that will be discussing the bills that we're focusing on. So really any questions you have or any information you're seeking about the legislative session, you can find at ledge.montana.gov. So it's important to call and call when needed. And this can be at times more impactful than email, especially when you respond to a Montana Wilderness Association Action Alert email by calling your representative at pivotal times during the legislative process, like we discussed earlier. So some quick tips. Phone calls don't have to be super eloquent to the legislative operator, but they should be clear and concise. And that legislative operator number is 406-444-4800. You can call that, or if your representative makes their contact information public, you can reach out to your representative. But when you talk to the legislative operator, they will write down your message. Say if I called earlier today and urged my representative to support Senate Bill 24, they would write down my message and they would take that slip and leave it on my representative's desk. And this is a place where quantity has an impact. You can also call an entire committee and leave the same message for multiple people, I think up to 5. So a really simple and effective sample script is, hi, my name is Jacob, and my zip is 59803. I live in your district. I'm calling today about Senate Bill 24, and then I'd like to urge my representative to support this bill. Thank you for your time. But of course, that's not the only way to reach out to our officials. You can also send a letter, email, or postcard. And although it's not as fast of a response as a phone call, writing can give you more space to lay out thoughts and connect personally. A hot tip, if you write your letter or email explaining an issue and you can give an expert or personal account of why it's important to you, it will be even more effective. And remember to remind your legislator that you are a constituent of theirs. And then finally, in terms of contacting your elected official, in-person lobbying and attending the session can both be valuable ways to contact your rep. So you can schedule a meeting with your senator or representative. Anyone can schedule a meeting by contacting their elected official and just simply requesting. During the session, though, our legislators are busy, so you might not get a response. If you want to meet with them about a piece of legislation, your best bet is to meet with them before the legislative session or possibly during the transmittal break when they often come home. But transmittal was a couple of weeks ago, and we are in the home stretch of the legislative session. But also there's public comment in the committee hearing. It can be a great way to lobby your legislator, pardon me. And it's also your one opportunity for public comment on a bill or resolution during the committee hearing. So you would have an opportunity to give a spoken testimony. And if you don't have that opportunity, if the line is long or they close the public comment early, you can sign in and provide any written testimony you've prepared ahead of time. And consider you may not have more than 48 hours of notice before a hearing, but also this is your one opportunity to be put on the public record. So some hot tips for in-person lobbying. You want to come prepared, make sure your information is relevant and you're ready to answer any questions. And then it can be helpful to know your legislator's daily schedule. So roughly 8 a.m. to lunchtime is morning committee. Your legislator will have about roughly an hour-long lunch break. From 1 to 3 is a floor session. And then from 3 basically until they've finished their business, there's afternoon committee as well. And as I think everybody would expect, staying in touch and developing a positive relationship with their legislator will make a really positive and big difference when trying to lobby them. But there are other great ways to speak out. And one of the most important ways to make that difference is simply showing up. And you can do this to public events or speak out using different forms of media. And it may sound like a passive way to enact change, but don't underestimate the power of a large group of people united on a single issue at a public event. And above is the photo of the 2019 Public Land Rally, where we filled the rotunda with close to 2,000 people. That was a big success. So, mobilizing, participating in a march, protest, or a rally. And obviously, like we just talked about, we had the Public Land Rally, which was a great opportunity to stand up for our public lands. Some other examples, though, were the Clean Power for All rally and the Camo at the Capitol rally and lobbying day that have taken place this session. Also, writing an op-ed or letter to the editor can be really effective. Once again, though, the written word may not be as fast-acting as a phone call or in-person meeting, but legislators getting pressure from media in their districts can go quite a long way. And this can be best if you have a strong personal connection to a place or are an expert on a place, a subject. Also, it's important to consider that timing is really important when writing. You'll want your LTE to appear at the right point in the process. You don't want it to get there too late. And possibly having something ready to go ahead of time can really help with that. And then finally, we think self-care is really important. The political process sometimes can take years, which means activists must take repeated action over a long period of time. And activist burnout can affect anyone. And so it's important to know your limits and develop some self-care habits. For example, we have a few helpful tips. Under self-education, diversifying your source of news can be really helpful. Be sure to always use critical thinking when taking in new information. Signing up for news alerts from trusted sources about key issues can be helpful. Joining email lists of local nonprofits to stay updated on current events can be an example of that, as well as avoiding untrustworthy sources, like not relying on social media too much. It's also important to unplug periodically. So take a break from the news if it is negatively affecting you, taking a toll on your mind and body. And it can be helpful just to turn the news off after a certain point each day, like maybe 7 o'clock, so that you can wind down before bedtime. Or ending your day on a positive note by practicing a rejuvenating practice. And then finally, of course, get outside. Enjoy the places you fight to protect. That can help strengthen your relationship with your special place, and it will enhance your advocacy and ensure you stay energized for the long term. And this link here is a link to Hike Wild, Montana, where we regularly lead hikes around the state through our Wilderness Walk program. And we lead walks to places that have been protected and places that are potentially on the chopping block as well. And then finally, although I'm sure a lot of us are already members, you can join Montana Wilderness Association, and that's a great way to be involved. From the Shining Mountains chapter in the western part of Montana to the Eastern Wildlands chapter in the eastern half, MWA has 7 community chapters that are a great place for volunteers, members, outdoor enthusiasts to meet up, lead and learn with each other, and celebrate our wild places. And a tax-deductible donation goes a really long way in ensuring we continue the work we helped start in 1958 of protecting and expanding wilderness for now and future generations. It helps us show representation of a large group of Montanans, which is important, and in turn shows power during the legislative session so we can continue to protect the places that we all love. But you also don't have to be a dues-paying member, although we wish you would. As a supporter, we'll still be in contact with you as the legislative session progresses. The easiest way to get information during the session is by joining our mailing list, receiving text alerts, or by following us on social media. And right now, there are millions of people across the country who are getting involved in the political process, which means there are numerous opportunities for you to get involved in a group that works for you. And like I said, we provide legislative information, calls to action both locally and on federal issues. We have an awesome podcast called The Trail of the Week, where we talk about different trails around the state, and MWA provides great community. And so finally, a quick recap of where we think focus points for folks to pay attention. Signing up for action alerts, making sure that you're informed on public land issues is important. Committing to take action on a short notice is incredibly important, so that you can take action during those choking points. And then finally, I'm going to open it up for any questions, but before I do, I want to share my contact info. You can reach me at my phone number here or at my work email. If you have any questions about this webinar, about the legislative session, about the work we do at Montana Wilderness Association, I'd be happy to get back to you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Noah again and Senator Flowers. Senator Pat Flowers is from Senate District 32, a Democrat from Bozeman. And unfortunately, I said this at the beginning, we were also going to be joined by Senator Gauthier. He couldn't make it tonight. He had a last-minute meeting regarding some legislation he's working on tomorrow. But Senator Flowers, before we get to questions, if you want to address everybody by talking about any main takeaways that you think are important, and then just sharing some of your general experience during the legislative session, that would be great.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think your suggestions are all good in terms of how to interact with your legislator, and I do think it is important, and I do think you can influence their opinion or stance that they might take on a particular bill. So I think all those are valuable. I know you tended to downplay emails, but I actually read those, and I pay particular attention to, in my case, anybody from Gallatin County. But I'll look at the names, and sometimes there are people that I know from across the state, and that will grab my attention too. I think the general rule is in the legislature, from what talking to other legislators, is that's how they approach the contacts, is they pay attention to their county, or if they can narrow it down to their legislative district, that's kind of where they put their focus. The reality is, for me, being on committees like Finance and Claims, but for sure Natural Resources and Fish and Wildlife, I get a ton of emails, and I literally can't respond to them all. I have been trying to respond to all those that come from Gallatin County, although that's gotten tougher in the last week. I've gotten a lot of messages, and I'm just, it's one of those things. Well, Jacob described the schedule, so there isn't a lot of free time during the day, so I'm trying to seize on every free moment to try and respond to people. If you don't get a response, don't assume it's not being read. Assume that it probably is being read, but whomever's on the other end either chooses not to, just feels like they don't have the time to respond, or they, or they've just run out of time. One thing that a lot of people don't know is about state legislators in Montana is we effectively don't have staff, so everything we do is on our own, from kind of all our work on legislation of our own, or preparing ourselves for committees, preparing ourselves for floor votes, is basically all on our own, other than we do rely on our own caucus for education on a bill that may not be on a committee that we're on that comes to the floor, and we rely on some of our caucus members who may have heard that bill in committee to educate us. The other thing I'd mention, and Jacob, I'm not sure whether this will play well with you or the MWA's approach to trying to get action on particular bills, but I would say if there's a way, if you know how your legislator feels on a particular issue and you can count on them to vote in a particular way, I would not send them a contact, just because in my case, it's one more that I don't have to respond to, since I am trying to respond. In some cases, people that I've responded to over and over again during the session, I kind of, after a few of those, I think they kind of get where I'm coming from. So on some of those, I've chosen then not to respond. But sometimes I get, Jacob, I don't know how you send out your alerts, but sometimes I'll get flooded with, on issues that, there's no question how I'm going to vote on a particular issue. And it sometimes can almost become an irritation, just because we're kind of overwhelmed with contacts anyway. So I would just pass that on.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. We try to strategically, when we're pushing people out to do grassroots lobbying, we try to be strategic about that.
Sure. Yeah, and I know it's got to be difficult. The other reality is there's you've got your own action alerts, and then there's lots of other groups like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. They have their own lists, and sometimes there's overlap. So you can really get blasted. And I mean, like I said, in some ways, in many ways, it's really good to hear how people are feeling about a particular bill. But there is a point where it can become counterproductive on somebody that is clearly supporting your position. So anyway,
certainly.
Enough said on that.
Well, do you mind if I ask you some questions that I'm receiving?
Sure.
So this one came from Vlad, and it asks, since most issues tend to follow party lines, how impactful is it to contact my representative if I already know how they would vote on a particular issue? And I feel like you already addressed it somewhat, as let's say you and your constituent are on the same side of the issue. But how about if you and your constituent are on opposite sides of the issue.
Yeah, I have appreciated those exchanges too, because I mean the bottom line is, as any legislator will tell you, and it's kind of hard to imagine until you're sitting, on the Senate floor or the House floor, and you've got to push the green or red button on every issue. There's no yellow button. So you can't. I know that I can't keep every one of my constituents or voters in my district happy on the way I vote on every bill. So I actually like the exchange, even if we disagree. And in every case but one, I would say this session, that kind of exchange via email or over the phone has been really respectful, and I think that's the way it's supposed to work. And we're all entitled to our own opinions, and we all have different perspectives on nearly every issue. And I think it's valuable for me to hear those, and sometimes it can influence my position too. So I actually welcome those kinds of exchanges with folks in my district.
Great, thank you. That's a good response. Noah, I think this one might be better for you to respond to. Don asked, how does MWA coordinate advocacy on the environment with other groups?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that one. So, first of all, most of the conservation and environmental organizations that you are familiar with have lobbyists in the building. And there is constant communication between myself, who I'm serving as MWA's lobbyist, and other lobbyists around what our positions are going to be and what our strategy is to be successful. So that's kind of a more informal way. We see each other in the hallways all the time. It seems like a big building until you've been in there for a couple weeks, and then you start to know where everyone's going to be and see each other very frequently. So there's kind of there's a lot of open communication going on and a lot of information sharing that's really helpful for the conservation movement as a whole. Some more formal ways that we participate and collaborate with other organizations. There is something called the Conservation Working Group, and that is convened by the Montana Conservation Voters. And we have a Monday morning meeting every week where about 15 different organizations participate, and we go around the circle and share information, but also let everyone know what our priorities are going to be for the week, and which of those priorities we'd like to elevate. Montana Conservation Voters also takes the lead by compiling what they call a hot list, which is a list for one list for the Senate and one list for the House of bills that the conservation community is supporting or opposing, and those are distributed to many of the legislators in the building. One last kind of more formal way that we coordinate is MWA convenes what we call the Public Lands Coalition, which is more limited to organizations that specifically work on public lands issues. And we have a meeting every week, Tuesday at 1 o'clock, where we all kind of do the same thing, talk about our priority public lands legislation and coordinate strategy and communications.
That's great. Thank you, Noah.
That answered it.
Yeah, thank you for asking the question, Don. And then I think Senator Flowers, this one is probably for you. Are legislators willing to issue party expectations to work together on issues?
Oh, I would say yes, absolutely. And I think the way it works in our caucus, we get together every day before we go to the floor, and talk about kind of, what's on the docket for the day that we're going to have to vote on, but also just kind of sometimes in more general terms. And there are quite a few bills that the watchword is vote your conscience. So, you're allowed to kind of weigh what you're hearing from your own constituents, weigh what you've heard from other legislators, across the aisle as well, and vote what you think makes sense to you or what's best for your constituents. So I think there's a lot of that opportunity. There are some issues where we try and, as a caucus, pretty firmly align, for example, out of the lands arena, but on a really important issue like reauthorizing expanded Medicaid. On that issue, we'll try and come in as a strong kind of single voice and all vote together. But there are very few of those issues during the course of the session that I've seen so far. Inevitably, a lot of us vote the same on a lot of issues, but it isn't because we've been told we have to as a caucus member, for example.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add one thing there, Jacob?
Yeah, of course.
This is my first session as full-time lobbyist for MWA, and I have seen, you go into it thinking it's going to be more like what you see on the news at the federal level, and it's really not as contentious as that seems. Kind of the big news stories that you see in the U.S. Congress. While there are plenty of ideological disagreements and some of that party disagreement, there are plenty of bills where Republicans and Democrats are supporting, and I think SB 24 is a great example of that. Where yes, we did get every single Democrat to vote for that, but also over a third of the majority caucus, the Republicans, also voted for it. So I think our issues, public lands and outdoor recreation and our outdoor heritage, we have a unique opportunity to bring legislators together because it's so important to people across the political spectrum.
Noah, you talked earlier about the wilderness resolution from Senator Wellborn, and I think that's going to be a good example of how we can work across the aisle to end up with something, albeit this is a resolution, but I think it could be important. And I think we're going to end up with a product there that all of us are going to be satisfied with. And so I think that's the value of trying to find ways on some of these lands issues to work across the aisle.
Great.
Absolutely.
So we have a few more questions as well that I want to make sure we get to. Patty asked, how can the public best support Habitat Montana in finance and claims? And then also, is there a role for the public to comment at this time? I don't. Whoever wants to address that.
Today was the hearing day, so in finance claims. So the public commented today. There were, I think, no public comments when it came to the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks budget. And I frankly think right now Habitat Montana is in pretty good hands in finance and claims. I'll be surprised if there are big changes, but I could be wrong. I hope I'm not, but I think it's in pretty good shape. It's hard to know then what happens on the floor because that's a little broader audience.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think we lose a little more control once it hits the floor.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think If you do want to send a message to your legislator or one of the members on the Finance and Claims Committee that lives in that represents a district in your county, and just telling them that's something you support, I think that's fine. We tend to not ask members to come to those appropriations or finance and claims hearings, just because they last hours and hours and hours, and you never quite know when your section is going to come up. So we don't want to have a bunch of people drive in from out of town and then have them sit there for 4 hours to only get to speak for a minute. But that being said, reaching out individually to your legislators or folks on the Finance and Claims Committee would be a great way to talk about Habitat Montana.
Yeah, I would agree.
That's great. Patty also asked, when we send a message via Montana Wilderness Association, is it considered as a single common message rather than individual messages? And Patty, feel free to follow up. I'm interpreting this question as if you fill out one of MWA's forms or action alerts to get a hold of a representative, is it one message with a bunch of people signing it, or is it that is then going to a representative or a senator, or is it, I don't know, 500 messages all going to the same legislator? And I can probably address that one. We had a public lands open letter is in support of Senate Bill 24. And the way we decided to do that, because it was getting so much support, is we took the single message and all of the people that signed it, and we broke that list down by which House district and which Senate district people lived in, so that we could show representatives the message and how many people from their district had signed it. And generally that's how we, when you sign a public letter or a petition through Montana Wilderness Association, that's how we divulge that information. But we might, I guess there are also probably some different approaches when it comes to forest planning as well, and sending in comments for a forest plan. But in terms of the legislative session, I think that's the tactic that we've used. Noah, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good. I certainly would imagine, and Senator Flowers can tell us his opinion, but the important thing when using an action alert is that you don't just copy and paste the message that's there, or the informational talking points that we've listed about the bill. You really want to make it unique and personal. So, make good points, but don't. I wouldn't just copy and paste what's there above the email form and just send it. I think that is probably easier for folks to overlook if they get 500 messages that are the exact same, as opposed to something that's a little more personal.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's absolutely true.
That is great. Senator Flowers, I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about responding to Montanans that are not your constituent. I know this question has come up a lot in past trainings where people are reaching out to other legislators around Montana. Can you tell us about your experience with that?
Sure. And I probably repeat what I said earlier. On certain issues, basically on maybe on nearly any issue, it's just impossible, as one person to respond. There just aren't enough hours in the day. And I get so many messages that I do get to the point where all I'm looking for, I'll pull up a message and all I'm looking for is the county. And if it's not Gallatin County, I move on just because I just don't have enough time to read them all, and I want to at least read the ones that are coming in from Gallatin County. So that's how I approach it. Maybe if you're not on, not every legislator has been assigned to as many committees as I have, and so some of those may not get as much input. I'm sure some of them don't get as much input from voters on a variety of issues, but I'm getting a lot, and that's the only way I can kind of manage it. So that sounds probably dismissive, and I feel bad about that, but it's also just reality. There's no way, there's just not enough hours in the day.
Great, thank you for that. It doesn't look like there are any other questions pressing right now. Senator Flowers or Noah, do either of you have any closing thoughts?
Go ahead, Noah. I have a few. Go first.
Sure. I think just the bottom line for me is that, as a lobbyist, I'm in there all the time. Our representatives and senators see me all the time. They know where I'm at on the issue. They can almost guess what I'm going to say when I walk up to them based on what's up that week. But there's something really powerful about you showing up in the Capitol or sending a message or making a personal call and telling your personal story. What I always tell people is that, these issues, our legislators have tons of people that are experts and informational folks trying, giving them the right information and informing them. But hearing something personal from a constituent about why that issue really matters to your life personally, how it will affect you and your family or your job or your way of life, that is the real value in citizen advocacy. And I would just encourage you all to continue to stay engaged with MWA, and if you have any questions, reach out to Jacob or myself. If you want to come down to the Capitol, I'd be happy to show any of you around and help you find people. So that's always an option, and I'd be happy to do it at any time.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's powerful when people show up and they talk to legislators and tell them how they feel on a particular issue. And so I'd encourage the same thing. I'd also say that we've got a citizen legislature that has its pros and cons, but the beauty of it is everybody that's there is there because I think they're trying to contribute and do the right thing. And it's not for fame or fortune, I can tell you that. And so they are receptive to you as, involved voters who care about issues, just like those of us who happen to be here care the same way. So I think you can have a really powerful voice, and in my opinion, we are really, really fortunate to live in a state that's still small enough to be a big, small town, and people know each other all across the state. And I think, regardless of your party, have a real commitment to the state, and I think are good people trying to do good things. And if you approach any legislator with that in mind and that kind of respect, I think your arguments are going to resonate. You may not seize the day with them, but I think you can be really effective as a citizen advocate with that approach.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think those are both great concluders. One of my takeaways from doing this around the state and having both former and current Republicans and Democrats there there to help answer questions and talk to former constituents has been that we all have Montana's best interest in mind, and that state politics are not nearly as divisive as federal politics can be, and that also the only way to get things passed is to work together and to especially when it comes to public land issues. There have been Republicans and Democrats and everybody in between and outside of that that have played important roles in protecting these public places in Montana. So I think that's a really important message. Anyway, I wanted to thank Noah and I wanted to thank Senator Flowers for both getting on. I want to thank everybody that asked a question, and then also everybody that hopped on today. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have any further questions, please get a hold of me at the contact information that I provided. I'll go back to that slide really quickly. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.